Welcome to Lead the Way with Anna Gauker. Your guide, Anna Gauker, is on a quest of her own to find effective ways of creating change and inclusion in our communities. You have come to the right place if you believe in truth, justice, and coffee. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, this is Lead the Way, and I'm Anna Gauker. I'm very excited to have you with us for this episode. Before I continue, remember to rate and review Lead the Way on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find us and grow this community. Our guest in this episode is Rita Mae Reese, an award-winning poet and author whose work has received a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, a Stegner Fellowship, and a Discovery the Nation Prize. If that wasn't enough, Reese is also the Literary Arts Director at Arts and Literature Laboratory, a community-driven, contemporary, nonprofit arts organization supporting the visual. She was a pleasure to speak with, and I'm certain there's a lot that you will learn from our conversation, just as I did. Here it is. Well, Rita, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell me kind of what got you into the arts and writing?
Sure. When I was young, I loved reading, and then didn't really. I thought I wanted to work in a bookstore or for a publisher or something reasonable like that. And then I was working for a small press, and one of their authors convinced me to go back to school and finish my degree because I dropped out partway through my undergraduate degree. So I went back and took a poetry workshop with a poet named Barbara Hamby. And one day after workshop, she said, "Did you ever think seriously about becoming a poet?" And I laughed and I said, "That's not a career choice. That's not something people do." And she said, "No, you're right. It's not a career. It's a lifestyle choice. But I think it's a lifestyle you would really like." So I totally bought into that because I love the idea of a lifestyle way more than I love the idea of a career. So I was like, okay, and then I applied for graduate schools in poetry and just haven't really stopped since then.
Can you remember the time that you wrote your first poem and what that experience was like? Like, how old were you?
I remember writing some in high school, but looking back, they were really terrible. But my English teacher was very sweet about them. And I do remember that thrill of getting to play with language and getting it to do something that's both private and public at the same time, if that makes sense. And I grew up I grew up in West Virginia, and I think a lot of people there have a real sense of playfulness with language. So I thought that this was a way to combine some of my creative impulses with that just inherited playfulness with language.
I came across this quote from you. It says, "I'm against poems that aren't against anything. Poems that only have one mind or fewer. Poems that go in one direction only. I'm even more against poems that go very slowly in one direction. I'm against poetry that's never smoked, can't take a joke and can't remember my name. So, what makes good poetry to you?
Oh, it's one of those things that you kind of know it when you see it. But for me, it is sort of risk taking, that it's doing something that doesn't feel prepackaged or authorized. And it's all about turns. So when I talk about it going in one direction, that's a poem that you can kind of, it's like when you guess the end of a movie. And I feel like being able to guess the end of a poem is even worse than guessing the end of a movie. Because I feel like you kind of emotionally invest in a poem. And so if it's not living up to its promise of something, and sometimes I worry about thinking of it as something new, because then we're always trying to do something kind of flashy and new. But this is something unexpected that I think just helps us keep opening up our brains. I feel like the poet John Ashbery, when I read his work, it does feel like it's getting my brain to operate in a way that it hadn't before. And I don't know exactly how he does that. I wish I did and I could do it myself. But I feel like that's some of what I hope for from poetry, that it reveals the power of language um, in a way that I can go back and access over and over again.
What is some of your other favorite writing, and how do you feel that it has influenced you?
I would say when I started going to school, well, my first love in poetry was probably Anne Sexton, and that was, I was taking a class at West Virginia State College, and I started going to the poetry section of the small local library, and it had this very tiny little poetry section, but they had, I think, most of the books of Anne Sexton, including her book Transformations, which is her retelling fairy tales in a very dark way. But I love the illustrations. And Anne Sexton is definitely, like, famous for smoking and doing all of those things that I guess I really started associating with what poetry could and should do. She was so just constantly kind of surprising in a way. And I think about the poet Evan Boland saying, we really look, the poets that will matter the most to us are the ones that give us permission. And I feel like Anne Sexton gave a lot of permission in her work to do things like to have that very sly voice and to talk very openly about being a woman, to talk openly about struggling with mental illness, to rework stories that we thought we knew totally and to open them up in a way that made them surprising and new. So she's one of my early loves. And then I kind of forgot about her for a long time, and I started reading Elizabeth Bishop and Jory Graham and other folks. But then when I was working on my second book of poetry, I realized that the person I go back to and probably write more like would be Anne Sexton.
Do you think that there's a poet that you would recommend for people who are just kind of starting out, getting into it, or don't feel like they are poetry people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know right now, think a lot of people are turning to Ross Gay as a poet who is really great at finding ways to celebrate, um, because contemporary American poetry can be pretty dark. And I feel like we're surrounded by so much darkness, difficult news, that it's really nice for a poem to be a little uplifting. But I think academic poets, particularly in academic academia were they were hesitant to be too uplifting. You know, they felt like they would get more respect by being dark. But right now, we really need poets like Ross Gay. So he's one that I would highly recommend. A lot of people come to poetry through the work of Mary Oliver. She has some great poems like Wild Geese that just ask very simple but profound questions like, what are you going to do with your one and precious life? I think there's so many great poets writing out there right now that I think it's a great idea to just go to the Poetry Foundation website, look at topics that interest you, and just spend excuse me, spend a little time looking for one that really speaks to you for whatever reason. And they have great videos on there too, which can be a fun way to find new work, to experience it a little differently. You can be a little more relaxed. I feel like people get kind of anxious when they read poetry because it feels like this test, kind of like a pop quiz in school, and you're like, oh no, I'm not going to get it. It's going to be over my head. It's going to make me feel dumb. But I think, you don't need to waste your time with any poems that make you feel that way. And instead go to them and think about, well, what can I find in this poem that's useful to me or that's fun to me or that can kind of broaden my horizons a little bit. And that's the only poetry that you should, make time for in your life, I think.
That is so useful to hear. I guess I'm asking these questions because in preparation for this interview, I remember being in school, like in high school probably, and saying like, I hate poetry. I hate it. And I think that a lot of that was I was intimidated by it, and also my general approach to school when I was growing up was about getting A's and not actually learning anything. So I would get so stressed about getting the right grades that I think it really got in the way of me fully engaging with the material, and why I feel like now as an adult I'm so much more interested in learning and being uncomfortable and trying to figure things out, because I can remember that I would finish a semester in school and be like, oh, what happened? I don't even know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I got it done. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
But
There's
yeah,
a
I
great
feel like,
poem.
what was that?
I was going to say there's a great poem by Suzanne Weiss, and the first line is, stop trying to be so smart. It's called Advice. I don't think that's one of my
so
favorite
true.
opening lines. Yeah, just relax.
Yeah, and I hear now people talk about poetry and say that reading your favorite poetry regularly can be like meditation. And that's really something that I think a lot of people need right now, especially.
I agree. Yeah. I also feel like it's sort of a vaccination against despair. And the thing is, you have to have it before the terrible thing in your life happens. And we all have terrible things in our lives. It's bound to happen. Like, very few people get through without having at least one pretty devastating event, at least. So you need to start kind of vaccinating yourself by finding the work that really speaks to you. So when the bad thing happens, you have that to fall back on. Because when the bad thing happens, you're not in a position to find new work. Your brain just isn't ready to absorb anything new.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of people could really use poetry right now.
What's your bad things happen poetry that you turn to time and time again?
Weirdly enough, I turn to usually Elizabeth Bishop, because she, I read her probably most deeply, and she has that kind of sense of humor and just careful observation. She was so good at describing images, and she lived in Brazil for a number of years. So there's a sense of like not being confined in my own American domestic scene. So it's expansive in a way, but it's also really familiar because I've read it before. So it's comforting and expansive at the same time. But I highly recommend. She loved working in form too. And so I feel like those forms which build up, a form is really just like using repetition, whether it's repetition of sound, repetition of rhyme, repetition of a particular line. All of that, a form is just using repetition to structure this experience of a poem. And so I feel like there's something about those forms that can also be super comforting when you're having a really hard time in your life.
Yeah, exactly. Can you tell me a bit about how you went from this lifestyle in the arts to your other job in a nonprofit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I had some friends in Madison who separately kept talking about wanting to start a literary arts center. And I was talking to them separately for a few months, and I finally said, let's just have a meeting and let's just do it. Okay. Like everybody get together and we're just going to do the thing. And so we called a meeting and had about 24 writers show up saying, yes, we would love to have a literary arts center in Madison. This town has so many writers. We have so much going for us, but we need a place where we can gather. And there used to be a great place called the Writer's Place run by Dale Kushner. And folks really mourned its absence. And so we wanted to create a place for writers to gather. And we started having write-ins at a place to be on Willie Street, which is a terrific, beautiful space right across from Madison Sourdough.
Yep.
And the woman who runs it, Chima, opens it up for community groups to have meetings there. So it was so helpful to us. We were able to have our meetings there, and we could have write-ins. And those are just an opportunity for writers to come and write quietly together. So you don't have to be in a coffee shop. You get out of your house, you designate this time. It's kind of like the idea of an artist date. So you set aside this time where you're committing to your own writing. And so we started having those at a place to be. And then a poet named Susan Albee, who's since passed away, put me in touch with Jolyn Rorda, who was starting Arts and Literature Laboratory in Madison. And so we met with Jolyn, and she said, well, it doesn't make sense for us to have these two different organizations. Why can't we just merge? And you guys handle the literary arts part, and I'll handle the visual arts part. And look, I have this beautiful space, and you can use it. And we were just thrilled. In fact, I was a little hesitant because I was like, this is too good to be true.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, what was it like? You said 24 writers showed up to your first kind of sit-down conversation. What was it like trying to get so many people to agree on what this was going to be?
That's an interesting part of all, is that we've managed to try to be really responsive to community ideas and inputs and not rigid about what we expect to have happen or any kind of artistic ideas we have. Like we're not just going to have readings that reflect the kind of poetry I enjoy reading. That's why we have a literary arts team. So we get a bunch of people together. So we have that first meeting. There were a lot of different ideas about what it would mean to be a literary arts center and what we would do and what our obligations would be and who could join and what that would look like. But then when we joined forces with all, we just started offering the program that we could, and we're volunteer based. So it's really people coming in and saying, I have this idea for a program, and then we either try to help them, either we provide the space and let them try it out, or we see if it fits in with our program and mission, and we then can put that on. So now we're trying things like the Midwest Video Poetry Fest. It's our first annual. We opened up a call for submissions, and we got over 1,600 submissions from around the world. So it's kind of trial and error. But one of our mottos is your ideas belong here, because we really don't want to just create a space for our ideas. We want to make it a space for Madison's creativity and ideas.
And for people who don't know, ALL is the shorthand for Arts and Literature Laboratory.
Thank you.
Yeah, so how do you decipher what ideas do stick with the mission and which ones are maybe for down the road or a different project somewhere else?
Yeah, and a lot of that is left up to our curatorial team, which right now in the literary arts area, so we have 3 different ones. We have a music curatorial team, we have a visual arts curatorial team, and we have a literary arts curatorial team. And so our literary arts curatorial team meets once a month, and we review proposals that we've gotten or ideas that we've come up with on our own, and we see if we have the resources and the time to do it. And we do some grant writing to see if we can get some support for what we want to do. So really, a lot of it is experimentation, just like you would expect from someplace called laboratory. We try it, and if people like it, we try to keep doing it, and we try to make it better if we can.
How do you design the workshops that are offered by ALL, and who would you say they're intended for?
It's a really great question, and that's one of the reasons I was excited to start a literary arts center, because I feel like there are a lot of people in Madison who want to learn more about writing, and we have a lot of accomplished writers. And it really is just bringing those 2 things together so they can benefit from each other, because the accomplished writers get to be better writers by teaching. And, it also helps them get a better teaching job in the future if they want to be a tenure track professor, or it helps them, just pay bills, which is also a great thing for a writer to be able to do. So really, we just have a call for submissions, and the individual writers come up with what they would be excited to teach. I had some experience running Stanford's writers program through continuing studies before I came here. And so I have a sense of what a class should look like, and what people are likely to sign up for. So that's helpful when we're reviewing workshop proposals, because then I can say, well, if you don't focus so much on this one, thing that might be intimidating to a beginning writer, and just catch it more broadly, then you might get more students. So it's a little bit of back and forth with the writer to make sure it will meet community needs, but it's primarily the writer coming up with what they would be excited and really able to teach well.
And what goes on in the visual arts side of ALL?
That's always really exciting. And I'm not very well versed in visual arts. So every time a new exhibition goes up, I'm amazed and like, oh my God, this is my new favorite artist. So every month and a half now, I'm getting introduced to wonderful work. But they have a similar process. So part of it is wanting to promote emerging artists in the area, and also bringing in some bigger names, which is what we do with our watershed reading series, so that you're helping kind of raise up emerging artists in Madison. But in order to do that, you need the reputation of the space to also be pretty elevated. So having that mixture of emerging with more established artists is really great for the emerging artists.
I know that a lot of what you offer all is about events and workshops. How have you adapted during the quarantine caused by our pandemic?
Yeah, we were working on and building out a new space for us that we're so excited about at 111 South Livingston. So we had closed our former space. We were still in the process of the building in March when we had to shut down because of COVID. And then we actually just finished. Well, we haven't finished furnishing the new building, but the construction people have kind of signed off and they've done what they can do. So we'll be able to start having gallery hours starting Thursday, August 13th, and do limited programming. But in the meantime, it did force us to really start looking seriously at technology that would help us reach more people. So we started having our write-ins on Zoom, which when somebody first proposed it to me, I said, that's a terrible idea. I don't think we should do that. I think, Zoom is awful. I don't want to do it. But it's been such a wonderful thing. Writers have loved it. And the way it works, we use the Pomodoro method, and we all check in together via Zoom and say what we're going to work on. And then we set the timer and we go away. You can turn off your video, turn off your audio, and just work for 25 minutes. Then we check in with each other again. And then we set the timer and work again. And then we do a checkout at the end. And writers have said over and over again just how much having that little bit of accountability and community has really helped them, because being able to focus during the pandemic has been really challenging for most people, I think, because we are being traumatized at some level by the fear and the relentless barrage of bad news. So our brains are not in the best position for creativity. So having a little moment of structure where you can relax into it and be creative has been really helpful for folks. And we're starting to learn live streaming our readings. We're live streaming some concerts. We've had we were in the middle of a script writing class when the pandemic hit. And so that's how we opened our Zoom account and just continued that on through Zoom. And so that's probably how our next workshops will go until we're able to start gathering safely. But I think we'll always now have a component of Zoom.
I was just wondering that, yeah.
Because it's been so useful for people that have trouble for whatever reason getting to an event, whatever reason that is, then they can still participate. And it just really expands the community, and that's what we're all about.
Yeah, and you mentioned the new location. How did you decide to relocate all, and how did that come together?
Well, we knew early on that our first space was 1,000 square feet, and we quickly started putting on, we were doing concerts and readings and workshops and write-ins, and then we started. We doubled our space, so we were able to rent the second half of our building to 2,000 square feet. But we were putting on over 200 events a year, and so it just was getting impossible. We had to have our write-ins off-site again because there just wasn't space on their calendar to keep having them at all. So we knew that we were growing. And then it turned out that our building that we were in wasn't zoned for assembly, which we had no idea about. So we couldn't have as many people in there as we would need to have at a reading or an art opening or a concert. So we needed to find a building that was large enough for all of those things. And the city had put out a call for proposals for this new building they were attaching to the parking garage on Livingston. And they wanted to have an arts use for it. So we put in our proposal, and sort of to our surprise, they chose our proposal. And so then we were negotiating with the city to make sure that could happen in a way that was satisfactory to both sides. And we got the approval for that in October of last year, I believe, September or October. But then it was after this long time of waiting, it was suddenly like, okay, now find a contractor and you got to do the build out and you've got to be moved in by June 1st. So go.
Yeah,
Like,
always.
what? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's how most exciting big things happen. It's like a lot of waiting, and then all of a sudden it's like, move. There you go. Make it happen right now. So I definitely, I know that feeling, and that's so exciting that you were able to get the space. I think it's going to be amazing.
Yeah. Yes. We feel so lucky. And then it was heartbreaking because we geared up to have 44 summer camps for youth this summer, and we were ready to, like, the building was going to open just in time, and we have this gorgeous space for the youth, and then with COVID we just couldn't do that safely. So it's a little bit more of like, the waiting, hurry up and do it, and then wait. And now we're back in the waiting for people to be able to access it. But
yeah, I think that's something that everyone is struggling with right now, is how do we make the most of this year? How do we make the most of this time while also acknowledging, like you were talking about before, just the constant stress and strain that we're all feeling, and not trying to stash that aside, but also feel productive at home. So I think that all is such a important part of that, and possibly even more now than before.
yeah, I think we've really realized through this how important arts and culture and stories are to us as just our daily lives. And when you're busy all the time, it's easy to forget that, or to think that, Netflix can satisfy that need for stories. But there is something about, like, the local experience and really being part of a community. I mean, I never went to movies, but now I really miss going to a movie theater because I'm like, I like that feeling of being with a bunch of people and you're experiencing something brand new
the
for the
energy.
first time. Yeah, that immersion,
Yeah, and that's another thing that I was going to ask, is how society often discounts the arts in terms of funding for programs. How is all designed to address that?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, we're 51st in the country for public arts funding. And we're right next to Minnesota, which is number 1 for public arts funding. So it's painful. Try not to look to the side what they're doing. So we've relied on about a third of our budget comes from grants. We apply for every grant that we think we might be eligible for to support our programs and our artists. About a third comes from individual donations. We're a membership-based organization, so anyone can become a member, and that money really helps provide matching funds for grants and things like that too. So, and that ongoing support has really helped us survive and thrive. So that's been crucial. And then about a third is from program-generated revenue. So things like tuition for workshops or concert tickets. That's most of it.
Are you mentioning like private grants or federal grants? Since I'm assuming there's not much available at the state level, but maybe that's not correct.
Yeah, at the state level, there's not a whole lot, but we do have Madison Arts Commission, which is wonderful, and Dane Arts. So they've been really great and have supported our programs, like our jazz programs. They've supported CS Art. They've supported our watershed reading series. They've supported youth arts for us, especially our outreach program. So they've really helped us make a lot happen. And so far we have not received a federal grant, but fingers crossed, we've just put in an application with the National Endowment for the Arts for our youth arts program. And I think it's a terrific application. So I'm hoping we'll get some funding.
What do you wish that more people knew about the impact that arts can have on individuals and communities?
We like to say that it's art is what helps community thrive, and community is what helps arts thrive. So I feel like it, in a way, art gives you permission to be beyond sort of a capitalist cog in the wheel, like to have higher expectations for your life, that you get to decide what the meaning in your life is. And art kind of can model that process of figuring out what meaning you're going to find in things. It's that idea that it's not art. It's almost like people tend to have an adversarial relationship with it, like that you're trying to, it's trying to intimidate you in some way. I think that's the way our culture has pitched it for a long time, that it's elitist somehow, but it's not at all. And I think it's really seeing that you can find art that not only fits you, but makes you bigger,
Yeah, exactly. And I think that you are poised right now to make that connection for people, to make the arts accessible. And that is so important. How do you measure success for all? And what do you envision for the future?
We envision, my hope is that we can begin to provide employment for artists, to start keeping some of the talent that comes through Madison, or that is raised in Madison, from leaving for some place that's better funded, like Minnesota or Illinois. I want to be able to provide, or Brooklyn, right, or California. I mean, they're pretty. Since we're 51st in the nation for public arts funding, they can go to Mississippi and do better. So we want to make that not true. We want to make this a place where you can, have a high standard of living and enjoy the arts and be an active member of the arts, and that it's not the realm of the academic, and it's not the realm of like a gallery where you might not feel comfortable, that it is truly for everyone. And that's what success looks like for us. We can tell by the people who are coming in and what they're saying and how they're responding to the work, and whether they feel like they can begin to participate, like taking workshops and writing their own work or doing their own painting. Then that's pretty much how we see success. I mean, there are metrics, and I just went through this whole process of creating goals and objectives and then evaluative processes. So I'm not a nonprofit person. I have an MFA in poetry, and they do not teach you to create tables with goals and objectives in an MFA program. But for me personally, when I know we're succeeding, when I hear from people who participated about the impact that it's made in their lives. That it's not just like, oh, that was good, I enjoyed it. But, this, like our Midwest Video Poetry Fest, we had an artist who exhibited last year. She saw our call for video poems. She's in Bangkok, wasn't able to come home and see her father in Wisconsin. So she, when she saw the call for video poems, asked him to collaborate. and they've been working with each other for over a month with emails and texts and everything to create this product together. And it was a way for them to come together across the pandemic, across this geographic distance to create. And I think like that's one of the best things art can do.
What's the next step for making that employment piece a reality?
That will be finding the funding to make that sustainable. And so it's, with COVID, our program revenue is almost non-existent because we can't have programs except online, and people really aren't used to paying for things online. So they can, there is an opportunity to donate, but we try to send that money directly on to the artists because we know so many artists are struggling right now. They've been hit very hard. So it is just creating an even stronger structure financially to make sure we're in a good position, because when you hire someone, you're making a commitment to that person that you're going to be there and you're going to meet payroll for the long term. So it's just making sure that is in place and really solid.
Well, this was very enlightening, and I do wish you and all the best. Thank you again to Rita Mae Reese. You can get more info about Arts and Literature Laboratory at artlitlab.org. Now, before we go, be sure to tell all of your friends that episodes of Lead the Way with Anna Gaukher can be found on Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and, of course, Apple Podcasts. A huge thanks to Buzz Kumper for his voiceover artistry in the opening. This episode was brought to you by the time and talent of Tyler Willenbrink, Natalie Tesh, Kara Supley, and Jeremy Van Mill. I'm Anna Gaukher. Until next time.